Moving on now, we're going to talk about the phylum Arthropoda, or arthropods. And these represent some of the most successful animals on the planet, both inland as well as in the ocean. If we look back in the fossil record, we also find that they were equally as successful. We see over 1 million different species of these on the planet, once again, both on land and within the ocean, and includes in the ocean such organisms as lobsters, crabs, shrimp, barnacles. So once again, some of these really delicious things that we like to eat. Wide range of size with arthropods, anywhere from krill, about 2 centimeters in size, all the way up to here we see a picture of a Japanese spider crab. The leg span of Japanese spider crabs can sometimes be up to 5.5 meters, and these can actually be very long-living organisms as well. Some can live to be over 100 years old. We do see 3 features that are really characteristic of all benthic arthropods, or all arthropods in general. We see that they have a segmented body. We see that they have jointed para-appendages, and this allows for a full range of motion. And we see that they secrete an exoskeleton. This exoskeleton isn't made up of calcium carbonate, it's usually made up of chitin, but the thing is the exoskeleton does not grow with the organism. So as the organism grows, the exoskeleton has to be molted. It has to be removed, shed by that organism, and then a new one has to be secreted. Let's take a look at a little handy-dandy image of the lobster here. What we see jointed appendages. So we have appendages here, and we find that the appendages often will have very specific jobs. So we might have appendages, for example, the pincers, which are used for defense, walking legs, swimming appendages, antenna, once again pairs, used for sensory reception. We even have things like mouth parts that you use to bring food into their mouths. We see, once again, you can really see this in this tail of this particular lobster, that they're segmented. And the segmented, once again, allows for that movement. It allows it for it to easily move. We have this exoskeleton, usually chitin, but sometimes it'll be hardened by other minerals or other proteins. And we can sort of break the body plan up, including the skeleton, into either an abdomen, thorax, and a head, or we can have something called the cephalothorax, which is sort of a combination of the head and thorax joined together, and then the abdomen. And this is very typical of most of these arthropods. Muscle attachments we find are on the inside of the exoskeleton, and the exoskeleton sometimes has to be very thick enough to be able to withstand the movement of the muscles, especially in larger arthropods. One group of arthropods are the barnacles. Barnacles are exclusively marine. We don't find them in fresh water, and they live in shallow and tidal waters, especially where rocky settings where you might have a lot of erosion occurring. Most are sessile, which means they don't move. They're suspension feeders. They sit there and they wait for the food to come to them. We also see that 2 of them actually have a swimming larval stage, which we're not going to get into too much. They can also be encrusters, so basically they attach themselves permanently to a hard substrate. That hard substrate is sometimes rocks, but we can find barnacles attaching themselves to organisms such as whales. They live basically upside down, so basically it's their butts that they're sticking up into the air, and they stick out their little tentacles or legs, and then they bring food into their body cavities that way. Other organisms love to eat them. So once again, for example, that carnivorous gastropod might come along, drill a hole into the side of this barnacle, and suck out all of the soft parts. Here we have, once again, some goose barnacles. We might revisit these guys later on when we talk about marine communities. And you can see these little sort of brown things. These are known as cirri. They're being extended for feeding. And once again, these help bring in food into the barnacle. Crabs, another delicious type of arthropods. Unlike the barnacle, which is attached, crabs are mobile. They're active animals, walking all over the place, doing whatever a crab does during their day. We look at their exoskeletons, very thick. If anyone's tried to eat crab, you realize that you really have to tear away that exoskeleton. Typically what they do is they walk sideways, and this is what we talk about walking crab-like, or doing the crab walk maybe in gym class at grade school. They walk sideways, and that's because the way their legs are articulated. It makes it a lot more efficient to walk sideways than to walk backwards and forwards. Some of these species have taken these legs, and they've actually developed into, over time, have evolved into paddles, which allow them to swim. They have really unique and complex behaviors. If you watch a crab for a while, they're very communicative. They can really exhibit aggressive. You might see them doing drumming as a way to communicate. Males will often fight to gain access to females, and we find them all over the place. For example, if we're in a rocky seashore, you find that most little cracks and crevices are occupied by crabs, and quite often crabs will hold battles over who gets what little particular hiding spot. They're omnivores. They eat anything and everything. Here we go, our good friend the lobster, yet another yummy and delicious arthropod. Once again, omnivores. They're sometimes referred to as garbage eaters. They just eat whatever is there. They can be scavengers. They can be cannibals. They'll also eat other lobster. They're an economically important arthropod. If anyone is familiar with a lobster fishery, you can bring in a lot of money. Most exhibit bilateral symmetry. So once again, you cut it in half. One side is the same as the other side, except for their claws, and sometimes one claw, especially their first set of claws, which is actually essentially a leg, will be slightly enlarged in comparison to the other one. The interesting thing about arthropods is they actually have blue blood. This is due to the presence of something called hemocyanin, which contains copper in it, which actually leads to that sort of blue hue to lobster blood. We find them in all oceans. They live on rocky bottoms, they live on sandy bottoms, they live in muddy bottoms, and they can occur from right close to the shoreline to almost the edge of the continental shelf. The final group of benthic organisms that we're going to talk about, and this is one of the 9 phyla that really dominate marine life, are echinoderms. If we took echinoderm, derm means skin, echino means spiny. So these are guys with spiny skins, and it makes sense if you look at like a sea urchin or even a sea cucumber, you sort of have these fine little bristles covering them. Once again, these occur everywhere. We find them in every marine habitat from shallow to deep water, and we find them especially abundant in deeper environments. Even though we sort of have at the top of the chain here, we've been going from more primitive animals to progressively more and more advanced animal forms, we find that these guys lack brains and eyes. But they lack brains and eyes, but they can also regenerate tissues, organ, and limbs. So it might be a trade-off right there. Once again, the ones that do have a shell will secrete a calcium carbonate shell. And we said there's a wide range of organisms that make up echinoderms, anywhere from sea stars all the way to brittle stars, urchins, sand dollars, sea cucumbers, and this group called crinoids, which we see a lot more of in the fossil record. One example of echinoderms are sea stars. We don't call them starfish. Fish implies that you have a vertebrae. These guys don't have a vertebrae. They're invertebrates. So sea star is probably the more accurate term. And one of the things we see about this type of echinoderm, as well as all echinoderms, are that they are radially symmetrical. So we've talked about bilateral symmetry. For example, the lobster, a couple slides ago, shows bilateral symmetry. You cut it down to half. One side is the same as the other half. Same thing with humans. Echinoderms are radial symmetrical. Organisms, typically what we see in the case of the sea stars, is they'll either have 5 arms or they'll have arms in multiples of 5. So sometimes we get sea stars with up to 40 or more arms. How they move, how they breathe, or respiration is they don't have any blood. Their vascular system is entirely based on water. So what they do is they pump water through what's called a sieve plate, or a sieve plate. That's the sort of in the bottom part. If we flip a sea star over and look at the bottom of it, we have the sieve plate on the bottom. They pump water through that and then into these tiny little tube feet, and we can see the tube feet there extended in the right hand side of the image to help move the sea star around. If you look at sea star, we'll find that they're typically very rough feeling, and that's because they have a tough covering on their upper surface. And if you take a close look at this tough covering, you'll see that's made up of thousands of tiny little plates of calcium carbonate with tiny little spines on their surface. And once again, echinoderm means spiky skin or spiny skin. Makes sense that in these sea stars, we see this little spines all over it. Sea stars, really famous for their ability to regenerate limbs and sometimes their entire bodies. So you cut off an arm and a new body will actually grow back. Reason why this is possible is most of their vital organs are sort of housed within their arms. So even though some sea stars might require their central body to be intact to regenerate, some can actually regenerate just from a single or from a portion of a severed limb, which is pretty cool when you think about it. Sea stars, we looked a little bit at this in the previous lecture, exhibit some very unique methods of eating. And basically, once again, you're looking at them eating from the underneath of the sea star. They have this really remarkable ability, once again, lots of cool things that sea stars do. Grow new limbs, use water to move around with as part of their vascular system. But what sea stars are able to do is they're able to, a lot of the times, consume the prey outside of their bodies. Basically what they do is they'll, for example, use their tiny suction cup-like tube feet. They'll pry open a clam or oyster, and then their stomach actually emerges from their mouth, oozes into the shell of that clam or oyster that it wants to eat, envelops the soft, gooey part, that visceral mass, to digest it, and then finally brings it back up into its body. So they eat bivalves. They can be nasty and eat other sea stars. So we'll see in B there. And here in image C, we see the stomach sort of emerging from their mouth. Most of them are opportunistic feeders. That means that they're just going to take advantage of whatever there is that is there to eat. But some species are predators, and they're going to prey on other benthic invertebrates, for example, the bivalve. We also have sea urchins. Sea urchins are another example of echinoderms. Sometimes you'll see them referred to as regular echinoids. Key feature or characteristic feature of the sea urchins are the presence of spines. They have spines that can be up to 1 to 3 centimeters in length, very tough to step on. Some you definitely don't want to step on because some are venomous, can make you quite sick. And the spines typically are for protection. These guys are great at eating algae, and what we'll see when we talk about sea otters is they play a really vital role, or not maybe a vital role, but they play a role in why sea otters and kelp forests exist together. If you wonder where the word urchin comes from, urchin is actually an old word for hedgehog, and it makes sense. Really spiny little guy here. Hedgehogs are really spiny little creatures as well. Like a lot of echinoderms, we find sea urchins all over the ocean floor. Here we see some right up against the ice in Antarctica. Those are sort of the pinky and orangey creatures that we see down there. We also see what looks like some scallops, as well as in the lower sort of left, we see something that is known as an Arctic, but as a brittle star. So over the previous slides, you've taken a look at a lot of benthic organisms, and benthic organisms, for the most part, the ones that we've looked at have been invertebrates. Now we're going to take a look at pelagic animals. So these are animals that sort of we find within the ocean itself. We'll see a mixture here of both invertebrates as well as vertebrates. The first group that we're going to look at are the zooplankton. And remember, we also talked about zooplankton very briefly when we talked about primary consumers. So these are heterotrophic organisms, just like all the other organisms we talked about in terms of the benthic invertebrates. Zooplankton, zoo or zoo means animal, plankton means made to wander or drift. And this is what these organisms do. They really don't have any mechanism by which they can forcibly propel themselves through the water, so they're basically floating around at the whim of ocean currents and ocean waves. As I said, primary consumers are heterotrophic. We see that they have a large size range. They can be anywhere from microscopic to several meters in size. And they include what we call holoplanktic and meroplanktonic organisms. We already looked at these a little bit in lecture module 10. But holoplankton organisms, they live their complete life cycles as plankton. Meroplanktonic organisms spend part of their lives as plankton before they graduate to either being part of the nekton, the swimmers in the ocean, or become a sessile benthic organism. One example of a zooplankton are these guys here, copepods. Copepods are small crustaceans, up to about 1 centimeter in size. Few interesting points about them. They have no heart, they have no circulatory system, but they do have an eye, and they have one single compound eye, and that is that sort of red dot in the middle of its head. They're believed to comprise about 70% of all larger primary consumers. So once again, this is a heterotrophic primary consumer. Some scientists might argue that they form the largest animal biomass on the planet. Anywhere from about 1 to 2 millimeters long, sometimes slightly a little bit longer, up to 1 centimeter in size. What else can we say about these guys? Other than the dominant form of zooplankton is that we find them in the polar regions. This is where we tend to see them reaching larger sizes. They occur throughout the world's oceans, and they're a big source of food for many different fish species. And here we have a still from a video of some Atlantic herring feeding on some copepods. Another type of zooplankton are foraminifera, sometimes called forms as well. We see that there are some that are benthic. A lot are also planktonic, so you might hear reference to benthic foraminifera, planktonic foraminifera. Large range of sizes, anywhere from 1 millimeter to 20 centimeters. We find them all throughout the ocean. I found them in waters as deep as the Challenger Deep. If you're wondering where the name foraminifera comes from, foraminifera, Latin means hull bearers. And you look at examples of all these different types of species of foraminifera here, you find that many of what we call their shells or their tests actually have small little holes, small little pores within them. Another interesting thing, especially if you're really interested in languages, foraminifera is one of those words that is both singular and plural. The shells, external shell that is secreted, usually known as a test. We can have both silica tests, SiO2, as well as calcium, calcareous tests, CaCO3. And if we were to cut into this foraminifera, what we would see is that it typically contains one or more chambers. 1 cubic centimeter sediment can hold hundreds and thousands of living individuals of foraminifera. Some places we find that this is a really important contributor to biological sediments. If you look at the pink sands of beaches in Bermuda, the color pink is usually as a result of the shells of specific species of foraminifera. Here we find all sorts of different species of foraminifera. Foraminifera, as they die, their shells or tests are constantly falling down into the seafloor, settling down to the seafloor. And we see that they are responsible for vast quantities or vast layers of sediment. They're also very valuable because they provide a lot of information on paleoceanography and paleoclimatology. From them, we get an example, or we get a taste, especially fossil foraminifera, of what the ancient oceans were like. And we also get a look at what the ancient climates used to be like. So they're a really good species that kind of locks in specific climatic as well as oceanographic data for a specific point in time. Another species of zooplankton are the krill. We talked about krill when we looked at food webs, we looked at trophic levels, and that fact that krill represent some of the main food sources, for example, much larger whales. Once again, like the copepods, another type of zooplankton, these guys are crustaceans. Within the Antarctic ecosystem, they're a valuable part, especially Antarctic krill. Once again, probably one of the species with the largest total biomass on the planet, and over half of this is eaten by whales, seals, penguins, and squid and fish every year. What else can we say about krill? Well, they eat diatoms. Diatoms, remember, are one of those primary producers, and in turn, they're eaten by many of these larger marine organisms I've already mentioned. The other interesting thing about krill is we find that they'll travel great distances vertically within the water column. They'll travel actually upwards in the water column at night. This is to obtain nutrients, and then they'll travel back down during the day.